you send someone to check the aircraft? You guys are doing the Hajj motion, right? Okay. Okay, you go for your life in my finance of the stuff. Yeah.
Yeah. Is there a gender policy in this one?
You what? We can have it, but like, I think we should have it.
Yeah.
So can you, before your speech, can you just like say your preferred gender pronoun? My name is Behrad. My preferred gender pronoun is he or they. Okay.
Okay. My name is Aidil. My preferred gender pronoun is he. Okay.
Is the live stream on?
Yeah. I don't know what it's recording, but I don't know whether it starts yet. Maybe it just started.
Yeah, it has started.
Okay, sure. Mr. Speaker, the global Muslim community has come to one agreement and consensus that Hajj is an obligation for every single Muslim for them to actually do. But here's the thing: when the obligation comes with a condition. If you can afford to do that, then that's fine. And secondly, I mean, like, you can do it whenever you want. If you feel like you don't want to do it this year, then you can do it another day. And thirdly, if you don't get to do it, let's say if you die before you even get to do it, someone else can do that for you. And therefore, we believe that actually, even if we boycott the act of doing of performing Hajj, we believe that actually at the end of the day, all these goals are going to be able to be done. Second problem is that as a progressive Muslim, we believe that actually whatever that we believe in is actually contradictory to whatever the Saudi Arabia believes in. But more often than not, Saudi Arabia has been very rampant and very brutal when it comes to the approaches that the progressive Muslim communities believe in. For instance, the freedom of LGBT community, on the rights of women and whatnot. And therefore, we believe that actually this is going to work as a platform for us to push Saudi Arabia, which is the single body, the biggest body that governs the Hajj as a whole, for them to actually change their stance and also their ideas on the things that are in favor of the progressive Muslim community. Sit down. Before I go on with my argument, a few characterizations that we have to do. First, when we're talking about Hajj, what does it mean, right? It is the act of Muslim going to Mecca to perform the ultimate form of congregation in Islam, which is actually Hajj. And it is also one of the 5 pillars of Islam. But like I stated earlier, you have to do it only if you can afford it, and in a way that you can sustain yourself and the people that you leave behind when you are doing it, i.e. the family members that you leave at home when you are away to Mecca. And then secondly, when we're talking about the boycotting, it is simple, right? We don't go to perform Hajj and we tell people not to go perform Hajj. Until when is this effective, Mr. Speaker? It is until the mentality of the Muslim community and the Saudi Arabia can be changed or else if not fully, then at least we are able to make them see that actually we have other interests, because the Muslim community all around the world does not submit with the brutal conservatism of the Saudi Arabia government. These are the things that we wanted to achieve at the end of the day. The burden of our side is not to tell that Hajj is bad, right? But to tell that the boycott is justified, to push the government of Saudi Arabia to work on the problems regarding their stance on the progression and moderation of global community, and also on the Hajj itself. First argument. Why is it justified for us to do so? Because it is on the stance of the progressive Muslims. We ask ourselves who runs the Hajj and pilgrimage. It is Saudi Arabia. But what is the nature of Saudi Arabia? They violate human rights, they oppress women, they oppress LGBT, they are terribly patriarchal in a way women cannot drive and women cannot vote until very recently. And they are also for religion extremism. When we look at what's happening, please sit down. When we look at what's happening in Yemen these days, right? Because even though like it is within the belief of the Muslim that everyone is equal, but just because they belong to Sunni and certain other people belong to Shia, and also due to this discrepancy, they are willing to put them aside and they are willing to go to war to that. We believe that actually these are all the things that are against the stance of the progressive Muslims. Who are actually aware of the human right, people who are non-discriminatory by nature, and people who are actually against the violation of the human law. How then can the progressive Muslim utilize this boycotting at the first place, right? Because they can put pressure on the Saudi Arabia to be more moderated, and it also tells the Muslim around the world that we disagree with them, with their extreme conservatism, that there is actually an active movement being done for us to actually push them to bring moderation, for them to be moderated. The question that will follow is then, will Saudi Arabia be incentivized to follow and obey whatever that we are doing? We say yes, because Hajj is actually one of the major sources of profit for them. Boycotting means they lose their source of income, and this is the source of income that they have full control over, right? Because other forms of income are actually being dominated, or maybe they are being subjected to other bodies. Like for example, they do have oil, but actually this oil are actually being controlled by the interests of the United States of America. Knowing that they will lose the income, at least they will obey. They will obey and they will follow, because at the end of the day, they know that they're going to lose the source of income that they are relying on. Before I go on, yeah.
So what's your yardstick before the boycott is deemed successful on your side? When women can drive, when gay marriage is legal, or when Saudi Arabia becomes a democracy?
Yeah. So here's the thing. Like I stated earlier just now, at least we are being able to change the mentality of Saudi Arabia. But secondly, the second yardstick, which is much more objective, is going to be brought in my second speech. Secondly, why is it justified then for us all, not only the progressive Muslim, but also the Muslim all around the world, to do this? Like I stated earlier, progressive Muslim is actually people who are who have the best interest in their mind regarding all these forms or all these kind of changes that they wanted to bring. But more often than not, when we're talking about the progressive Muslim, these are the people who doesn't have the hesitance for them to actually watch over whatever things that are concerning them. And when we're talking about not only on the points of the Saudi Arabia itself, we believe that actually Hajj, the way Hajj is being ran these days, are problematic. Because first, Hajj is being commercialized, right? Because like we have seen how religion has long been commercialized. And the commercialization of Hajj makes it harder for the Muslim community to perform Hajj. It becomes expensive. The accommodation that they have in Saudi Arabia or in Makkah are extremely expensive. In order for them to be able for them to sustain that, they have to go and find the cheaper place for them to stay. So we say that actually all these accommodations are not available within the vicinity of Makkah itself, of Kaaba itself. They have to go far, and these are going to be problematic to that. Like I stated earlier, Hajj can only be performed if and only if you can afford to sustain yourself and the people that you leave behind. But when you do this, when you're making it hard for them to actually sustain themselves, we believe that actually it is contradictory by nature, and these are the kind of things that we are going to push for the Saudi Arabia to actually change. And like I said, and the outcome of this is that when you boycott and you encourage people to boycott, you let people understand why you do so. You are not telling people that actually you're doing this because you are actually against your religion. No, because actually at least when we are boycotting, there will be incentives by this progressive Muslim community to actually tell people why they are doing so. We are going to tell people that actually, look, we are not against the religion per se. We are only against the way they are doing it. If you wanted to do it, if you really wanted to let people perform the Hajj, then at least they need to be able to make it accessible to everyone. And the second problem is that on the point of security, they don't care, right? And the government of Saudi Arabia don't care, because if we look at the earlier this year, where there is actually an instance of problems, for example, the stampedes that is happening, and also the falling of the crane in the Saudi in Mecca, it is because it is within their interest of mind where they wanted to do that, and they don't care about the security of the people. When we boycott, we will tell them that actually the reason why we boycott this is because you have to ensure that the Hajj is going to be safe for us. Only then we're going to go to do so. I am also, as a Muslim, I don't go against Hajj, but I'm with the idea of safe Hajj and accessible to everyone. Thank you.
Speaker of speech, now I'd like to invite the leader of opposition to start case for opposition. Yeah.
Side's opposition stance is very simple in this debate, Mr. Speaker. We think any change that side opposition wants to achieve is best achieved comparatively when you have greater moral legitimacy under your paradigm, is when you have a greater critical mass of people under your paradigm as well. We think this is best done when you do go for the Hajj as a progressive Muslim. My substantive will elaborate on that. But first, some rebuttals. First, they tell us, okay, they have a huge set of problems with Saudi Arabia, right? But we came out in POI and asked, what is the yardstick you use to say, okay, Saudi Arabia is good enough now, we shall now continue and go for the Hajj. The speaker refused to answer it, pushed it to second speaker. We think that's a fundamental problem with the debate, right? It necessarily creates a hung case, Mr. Speaker. More than that, we think it's extremely important so that we know what we can respond to. You see whether this yardstick is a fair one, an unfair one, an extremely low but extremely high burden. On that basis, on rules of debating alone, unfortunately, they lose the debate. But regardless of the kind of yardstick that you may use, Mr. Speaker, we think to a large extent, progressives can always and easily find fault with Saudi Arabia because like with any country in the world, they are not the kind of progressive utopia that you wish it to be. Even in the Scandinavian countries, there are problems with xenophobia and immigration, Mr. Speaker. We think to a large extent, progressives can and always will find fault with Saudi Arabia, and on that basis, it means there will always be criticism. And if you want to make a boycott on such principled grounds, the logical conclusion is that you will never cease this boycott, Mr. Speaker. We think, therefore, all of the analysis about how you can always go in future necessarily becomes quite contingent. Let's consider that then, right? Because the fact is, when Islam is the third largest religion in the world and is growing, it's the fastest growing religion, it means that you honestly may only have one chance at the Hajj in your life. Odds are you may never even get to go for the Hajj in your life because of that long a waiting list, Mr. Speaker. This means if you have that one chance, and we think this means that it becomes extremely important that you take it, and comparatively, the effect of your boycott therefore becomes significantly more minimal, because if you decide not to go, someone else will take your place instead. Let's consider this regard to outcomes analysis that they wanted to talk about. They told us, Saudi Arabia relies on massive amounts of money from the Hajj, right? And they profit off it to a large extent. They told us further that, hey, oil isn't that big a thing. Wait a minute. Everything in Saudi Arabia is built off oil, Mr. Speaker. Aramco, which is underway the biggest IPO in the world, okay, is going to be able to generate that large amount of money because they are the biggest company in the world, because of all the Saudi Arabian oil reserves that Aramco controls, which is Saudi Arabian government owned, Mr. Speaker. We think to a large extent they do have their facts wrong. Like Saudi Arabia, to the extent that it may be rent-seeking vis-a-vis the Hajj, the comparative amount of money they make from one event, across 365 days is negligible compared to the billions and billions of dollars they make a day, even today when a barrel of Brent crude is $49 a barrel. We say, therefore, the kind of impact is limited. Last, then, they tell us, okay, there's a huge power and lack of access, yet they tell us there's massive power security. The more people you have, when it's already massively overcrowded, means there's going to be more and more security problems, Mr. Speaker. To the extent that there may be stampedes or a couple of plane crashes, let's be frank, Saudi Arabia has been working extremely hard to make the Hajj safer and safer day by day with like new highways and new walkways for people to walk through. We think it's honestly quite incredible that when they do this on their own and they don't seek like external expertise, external help to design all this kind of thing, that the death toll hasn't been higher, Mr. Speaker. I think honestly, like Saudi Arabia has to be given some credit there where it's due. Let's move on to substantive material. I'll be talking to you about several things. First, I want to talk to you about how this is antithetical to your Muslim identity and the outcomes thereafter. Second, your comparative duties as a Muslim individual versus your duties to the rest of the world. And last, like the analysis of changing of opinion. But before that, I will accept a point. Excellent. Right. So let's talk about your identity as a Muslim individual. So, like I put it to you, Mr. Speaker, that there are some things within faith that are non-negotiable. Many things are socially constructed, many things are debated. But for example, in Christianity, right, like you must accept that Jesus Christ is the Son of God and He died for our sins and then He was resurrected 3 days later. Right? Everything else you can debate, you can negotiate whether you should care about Leviticus or not, but that you must accept. Same with Islam, Mr. Speaker. There are 5 pillars of Islam, one of which is the Hajj. If you can go for it, you should damn well go for it because the Quran said so, because Allah said so, Mr. Speaker. We think this means that it becomes very important. We think to a large extent your Muslim identity is very Hajj-centric. You pray in the direction of the Kaaba, which you go to for the Hajj. You zakat so that people who are less well off than you can afford to go for the Hajj, Mr. Speaker, alleviating the kind of financial concerns they consider. Last, where the Hajj is one of the 5 pillars of Islam, Mr. Speaker, this is literally God's word, we think. Right? So what if like you go against this Muslim identity? Like 2 levels I want to talk to you about. First, on a societal level, we mean broadly, it means that you lose kind of lobbying power versus other Muslims, like your non-liberals or your moderates, because they see you as a heretic, see you as someone who is like not necessarily a true Muslim or a true believer, right? And you think your lobbying power goes down because you claim that your analysis and your thinking is more important and more credible than the literal word of God, Mr. Speaker. But more than that, we think it's going to be very easy for Saudi Arabia to paint this as like a Western idea, or Western imperialism, Mr. Speaker. Delegitimizes the liberal movement and all your other allies as whole. On a personal level, Mr. Speaker, we think you risk the wrath of God because you act in clear and open defiance to one of the most central tenets of Islam, Mr. Speaker. You say that you fear God, then you say you cannot do this, that you will necessarily risk like the ability to access paradise, Mr. Speaker. And I think you'd be complicit in sending other people to hell as well, that you would be a false prophet, and that's necessarily problematic. Let's compare your duties to other people who are oppressed versus your duties as a Muslim person. We think first, Mr. Speaker, as a religious person, your duties to God first and foremost, right? When God tells you to do X, you still do it, even though it may go against your own personal moral convictions. Right? Because the laws of God trump the laws of men. Why is this the case? Because your time on earth is first temporary, Mr. Speaker, while the time in paradise is eternal. This means in talk about utility calculus, you're talking about infinite value versus a very finite value, Mr. Speaker. We think this is a trade-off which is too risky to bear. But 2, Mr. Speaker, God will punish these infidels anyway if they are really as screwed up as proposition wants us to think they are. So let's think, how do we change opinions anyway? Because we think that any changing of opinion requires like critical mass of people, right? Like people to support your cause. And for people to support your cause, they need a perception of moral legitimacy. We think moral legitimacy must be viewed with an Islamic lens, Mr. Speaker, and not through your progressive moral lens. This means that you need credibility as a Muslim individual. That you are a Sayyid, for example. That's how Baghdadi gains credibility. And you need to be from the house of Al-Sabah, for example. And that we think, like otherwise, like when you don't go for the Hajj, you come to others as a heretic, you'll be going to hell anyway. No one wants to listen to you. We are opposed.
This. Please speak for speech. Now let me advise Deputy Prime Minister. Yeah.
Here.
We believe that when you deprive something from yourself, such something that's very important, for example, it could be important for your spirituality, for example, and you boycott the Hajj, it sends a strong message to the community that there is an inherent problem that you need to fix within the Islamic community. That's why we believe there is a lack element of awareness from side opposition or in status quo to further progress discourse about the problems within the Islamic community. That's what my substantive will be dealing mostly about. So a few responses before I go on, right? Firstly, with regards to the yardstick, we believe that ID has already answered the PI by saying that when it's sufficient to change the mentality of the Islamic community, right? Because we want people to have more discussions about these kinds of problems that they don't want to talk about. Because then the outcome of this political discourse would be the political outcomes that we would want on our side anyway. Things like how we could increase pressure for certain actors, like Saudi Arabia, how we push pressure for them to, for example, create more for women policies or like stop oppressing the LGBT community and whatnot. We also believe this pressure could also exist for the global community as well, because now the global community is more aware of the problems within Saudi Arabia and also the problems within the Islamic community. So more importantly, the pressure on Saudi Arabia also means that there's a pressure on the US as well, because the US is one of the biggest allies of Saudi Arabia. Even in status quo, the US is criticized for aligning with one of the countries that propagate gross violations of civil liberties and human rights, because they're sexist and misogynistic as hell, and they oppress LGBT communities, right? Which is what the United States is very inherently against. So even now, we can see that the US is trying to move away from Saudi Arabia by trying to produce more oil. If we create more pressure on them, and Saudi Arabia would be afraid to lose the US, since the US is one of the biggest superpowers in the world, we believe it could create enough pressure for Saudi Arabia to change. That's why we believe they recently allowed women to vote in order to mitigate the pressure from the global community. Secondly, on how we would always find fault on Saudi Arabia and whatnot, but we believe that everyone finds faults in certain countries. Right? We also find faults in the US, for example, for like torturing prisoners in Guantanamo Bay. But there's a degree to what kind of fault is acceptable and unacceptable. And we told you these kinds of faults, like spreading Islamic extremism, that becomes the seed of Sunni jihadism, also the corruption of Saudi Arabia monarchy, and also for being anti-women and anti-LGBT. These are the kinds of things we want to change, and these are the kinds of things that are unacceptable on our side. Before I go on, sure.
The harms that your first speaker talked about are massive. Yet your benchmark for stopping the boycott is like this cost. How is that proportionate? How is that likely to be effective?
I'll go into that right now, right? Because my substantive is dealing on how we facilitate and progress discourse and how political outcomes will then exist better on the outside. So when you boycott, it sends a strong message to people. It injects the element of awareness that not just about Saudi Arabia, but also the ideologies that Saudi Arabia have spread globally. For example, puritanical Wahhabism and anti-women interpretations of Islam and whatnot. So the influence that Saudi Arabia have is massive. They're seen as the leading figure in Islam because they're more influential than other Islamic majority countries or other Muslim countries. For example, they're friends with the US. They are also rich. They have oil, and also they have the Mecca within that country. So people see them as a leading influence when it comes to Islam, and people tend to follow what they do. So that's why they take advantage and propagate extreme ideologies that have heavily influenced Muslims and Muslims around the world. For example, the rise of extremism in Southeast Asian Muslim majority countries can also be attributed to Saudi Arabia because of the rise of Arabization and whatnot, right? So the puritanical idea of Wahhabism is the core ideology of Sunni jihadists like ISIS, for example. So these are the kinds of influence that they have within the world in status quo. So we believe that when you boycott, when you boycott the Hajj, it increases the likelihood of awareness that there is a problem about this day. Because it is done at the expense of performing the fifth pillar of Islam. They talked about how important it is, right? So when people see that they do this, it must be something that warrants attention. And attention will be warranted on the outside because this is a controversial move by progressive Muslims. So how does the discourse progresses under our side then? We told you that with boycott, there's an increased sensitivity of awareness, right? And even with regards to what the dubious moral legitimacy that Wilson has spoke about under his side, you believe that discourse can still happen anyway. So even if these people disagree with the means that progressive Muslims use, they can still discuss on other areas about Islam because the awareness of other problems about Islam also increases. Just because we don't acknowledge their means doesn't necessarily mean you don't acknowledge that there are other problems in Islam. Debates can happen in which both sides, the progressive Muslims and conservative Muslims, can justify whether or not this boycott, not just whether or not this boycott is good or not or bad, but also whether or not this problem do exist. How do we best deal with that problem? For example, besides creating pressure on the global community as well. So, like in order for them to even though you might think that they have dubious moral legitimacy, but these progressive Muslims are able to pinpoint certain moral inconsistencies about Islam as well that has been corroborated by Saudi Arabia. For example, how Islam also promotes gender equality, for example, and that's how it's inconsistent to the anti-women policies in Saudi Arabia. So that's how we believe discourse can happen under our side. But on the converse, what happens under their side is that they lack the element of awareness, and they lack this kind of constructive discourse under their side, because people don't see anything controversial going on. People continue to become unaware of the problems within Islam. That's why we see religious extremism rising from day to day among the global communities, right? That's why we believe when you boycott the Hajj, there's an exclusive benefit, which is you get that element of awareness, and that's how you increase participation within discourse. Because people would want to defend what they view about religion, because this is their religion, this is what they have been thought to be right or wrong, even from early on, right? So we believe that under our side, we have the element of awareness, and we have that more discussion going on.
Based on your speech, like in my deputy position,